Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. As we are about to begin, may I request everyone to be seated. Good morning, everyone. We're about to begin the program. Your Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, good morning. We are pleased to welcome you to the Foreign Service Institute today. My name is �11𝗿𝗄, and I will be your moderator for today's Mabini Dialogue. We will discuss the Northern Ireland peace process, and I was also advised by the Embassy of Ireland that our distinguished scholar We'll also discuss the 50 years of Ireland in the EU. And so you're free to ask questions about the experiences of Ireland being a member of the EU for 50 years. To begin today's program, may I invite the Director General of the Foreign Service Institute, Assistant Secretary Francisco Noel Fernandez III, to deliver his opening remarks.
Thank you very much. Excellencies, Ambassador William John Carlos, our distinguished speaker for this morning, Professor �11𝗠𝗏, colleagues in government, ladies and gentlemen. I am pleased to welcome you to today's Mabini dialogue on the Northern Ireland peace process, lessons for the Philippines, and Ireland in the EU. So it's an expanded title for this morning. Today, we engage in the all-important human endeavor of learning from each other's experiences. Nowhere is this more significant than in our efforts to end armed conflicts and ensure that we prevent them from happening again. In this Mabini dialogue, we aim to raise awareness of the dynamics of peace processes by drawing parallels and lessons between the Philippines and the Northern Ireland narratives. We aim to instill in the audience the value of taking care of hard-won peace dividends and the importance of working to sustain the gains of the peace processes. The year 2023 marks the 25th anniversary of the landmark Good Friday Agreement, signed between the United Kingdom and Ireland, essentially ending 3 decades of violent conflicts in Northern Ireland. The agreement is largely credited to have significantly improved the security and economic situation in Northern Ireland. With the help of our esteemed Irish scholar, Professor �11𝗠𝗏, we hope to learn further from the best practices of the Northern Ireland process as it deals with its own implementation challenges. We will explore the current challenges to the sustainability of the benefits gained from the Good Friday Agreement and share mechanisms that may apply to the Philippine context as our country manages the crucial transition from war to peace in some parts of our regions. On a personal note, and I shared this earlier with our guest, I had the privilege of initiating our learning experience of the Northern Ireland peace process during my tenure as Minister for Political Affairs in the Philippine Embassy in London. I did so by arranging the initial discussion between my then Ambassador 𝗕𝗿𝗍𝗍 and then First Minister Ian Paisley and then Deputy First Minister Martin McGuinness when we visited them in Stormont Castle in Belfast in April of 2008. This led to the visit to Manila by Jonathan Powell, the Chief of Staff of Tony Blair, and a meeting between former Prime Minister Tony Blair and then President Gloria Macapagal-Arroyo during her visit to London in December 2007, followed by visits to Belfast of Filipinos involved in the Mindanao peace process in 2008. I likewise had the privilege of learning further during my January 2009 visit to the Glen Cree Center for Peace and Reconciliation in Dublin, where some discussions leading to the Good Friday Agreement took place. In closing, I wish to take this opportunity to thank the Embassy of Ireland for partnering with us in making this conversation possible. I look forward to this conversation this morning. When I say conversation, we look forward to the interaction between our guest speaker and the members of the audience on those two issues which he will be tackling, the Northern Ireland peace process and Ireland in the European Union. With that, thank you very much, and I look forward to the talk of Bridget.
Thank you. I will introduce you first. Thank you. Thank you, Assistant Secretary Fernandez, for that warm welcome remarks. As our Director General has mentioned, we are honored to have a distinguished scholar with us today who will discuss with us 50 years of EU in 50 years of Ireland in the EU and the Northern Ireland peace process. She will share with us her insights on the best practices that can be gleaned from the Northern Ireland peace process and, of course, the experiences of Ireland within the EU. Professor 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗏 is an Irish political scientist, Emeritus Professor at the European University Institute in Florence, Italy, where she was the director of the Robert Schuman Center for Advanced Studies, director of the Global Governance Program, and the European Governance and Politics Program until her retirement in 2021. She became president of the European Policy Center think tank in December 2022 and has been chancellor of the University of Limerick since November 2023. Previously, Professor �11 was professor of European politics at the School of Politics and International Relations, University College Dublin. And in 2004, she was elected a member of the Royal Irish Academy. In November 2018, she was ranked among the women who shape Europe by Politico and was also awarded by the University of Limerick Alumni Association with its highest honor. Ladies and gentlemen, would you please join me in welcoming Professor 𝗕𝗿𝗄𝗏.
Thank you. Director, Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, it's a great pleasure for me to be here in Manila this morning to talk about a small country on the other side of the world, Ireland, and the Irish experience both of statehood, of deep interdependence, but also of addressing deep, deep conflict on the island of Ireland is quite a remarkable story for a country that has just passed its first century, 100 years ago. And let me start with, if this works, with two photographs. Wait, I'm not so sure it's... Yeah, let me start with two photographs because the history of my country is in both those photographs. The first photograph on the left is of Michael Collins, who signing the Anglo-Irish Treaty that gave birth to the Irish state. And at the time, those were very tough negotiations with our large neighbour and then one of the world's greatest empire. And Michael Collins knew when he signed that treaty that he was signing something that was less than what the country wanted, less than what Irish nationalism demanded, but he bet on the Irish state. He bet that this was the best opportunity to create an Irish state. And then the photograph on your right is our Taoiseach Prime Minister on the 20th of January 1972, signing a second treaty, and that treaty was to make Ireland a member of the EU. So those two treaties, almost 50 years apart, captured the story of a small island and a very small state. And so Ireland, as I said, has just 100 years of statehood, and the Irish state was established through a very classical 19th, early 20th century. It was, the Irish wanted sovereignty, it was a state-seeking nationalism, but the cost of Irish sovereignty, the cost of the Irish state, was that the island was divided between the 26 counties that became the Irish state and the 6 counties on the northeastern part of the island that remained part of the United Kingdom. And that meant from the very beginning that, in a sense, there was Irish statehood. Irish statehood was not, for the views of many on the island, complete, but it was sufficiently complete for an Irish state to join the nations of the world. And then in 1973, and this was on the basis of the overwhelming majority of the Irish people, 83% voted for EU membership, the Irish decided that traditional sovereignty in one country was not the future of the country, and so the decision, overwhelmingly, the choice for Europe, the choice to join the European Union. And this transformed Ireland, and this is part of why we need to think of the Irish peace process not just of what happened between Britain and Ireland and the Good Friday Agreement, but also how the the Irish state became a self-confident country that was capable of also negotiating that outcome. So when Ireland joined the EU, it was a very poor country. It had per capita incomes only about 65% of the EU average. It had a population of 2.9 million, now 5 million. Its per capita incomes are now higher than the average of the EU. And in 1973, 24% of the Irish labour force worked in agriculture. Now it's 4%, and also services. Also, when Ireland joined the EU, there was a far lower proportion of the Irish population in third level education. So Ireland was economically and socially transformed in the period since EU membership, and membership of the EU was a driver of modernisation within the state and the society. But then this coincided with this is not behaving very well for me. This coincided with the shadow of the past. And that shadow was the outbreak of communal conflict in Northern Ireland. So the Northern Irish state had a very significant Unionist or Protestant majority. And that meant that there was a section of that society that basically did not have political power, did not have voice, and was not part of the normal day-to-day politics. And in the 1960s, and it was again a product of education, the nationalist or Catholic minority in Northern Ireland began to agitate very heavily for human rights, and it was part of that wave of the global human rights of the 1960s. But it spread into communal conflict, and from then, towards the end of the 1960s until the Good Friday Agreement, you had a quasi-civil war in that part of the island of Ireland, and it had consequences also for the British mainland with the activities of the IRA and bombing, and also consequences for the Republic of Ireland. And that violence didn't entirely end with the Good Friday Agreement in 1997, 25 years ago, but almost did. But the one important thing that I want to stress is that we shouldn't assume that the Good Friday Agreement ended the conflict. It did not. It moved the conflict from violence to non-violence. So in other words, some of the key issues between the communities survived, but it wasn't violent. And that meant that the Good Friday Agreement saved the lives of large numbers of people on the island of Ireland. So we need to think about peace processes not as necessarily removing all of the conflict or not necessarily removing all of the contention between the participating parties, but enough of the contention that you move the issues from violence to politics and you maintain the issues within a political framework. And that is, in a sense, the story of the Good Friday Agreement. All the ups and downs since 1997, but it has been about not allowing the conflict to return to a violent phase. And I would say that it's probably safe to say that it is very unlikely over the next cycle that there will be an outbreak of serious communal conflict on the island of Ireland again. So in other words, the Good Friday Agreement has succeeded in its macro aim, which was to remove the gun. And if you think about Irish history, successively it's been about taking the gun out of Irish politics. And so we have to hope that the gun is now finally silenced. But if I go back to Ireland's experience of EU membership, this is from our main newspaper. It did an editorial on the 1st of January 2023. And in a way, it's an assertion of what EU membership meant to Ireland, that Ireland became prosperous, became socially progressive and self-confident, and that happened in tandem with and partly as a consequence of EU membership. And we have to, it's really important to think in terms of how a small country, because small countries have limited power, they have limited capacity to shape and influence the world about them. And so small countries have to be better at statecraft, have to be better at in diplomacy, and have to be much smarter than larger and more powerful states. And I think in international relations, because I'm a political scientist, not an IR scholar, I don't think IR scholars pay enough attention to how small states navigate their way through the world, because small states have fewer resources and capacity, and therefore have to, in a sense, try to shape the world and deal with the challenges that they face in ways that are almost smarter, because they can't rely on the toolkit of hard power. And so I think that the Irish experience of how it managed membership of a larger union is very insightful in terms of small states. But I was going to take you through the different phases of Ireland's membership, and let me just say that it was not, Ireland did not suddenly join the EU on the 1st of January 1973 and all of its problems were solved. It takes time to learn to be part of a highly complex, highly competitive international system like the EU. And so it took Ireland quite some time to learn to be a member state, what it meant to pool sovereignty and not just to exercise sovereignty. But one important consequence, and this feeds into Northern Ireland, is that joint membership of the EU by the United Kingdom and Ireland was very transformative of the relationship between Dublin and London, in the following sense, that for Dublin, it gave the Irish state and the Irish state elite the confidence that it could play on a bigger stage, that it could be a partner with the UK as joint members of the EU. And there was also almost a psychological weakening of the dominance of the UK, because although Ireland had been independent from the 1920s onwards, the Irish economy was still very dependent on the British economy when we joined in 1973. But that simply disappeared. So the fact that Ireland pooling sovereignty strengthened Ireland's sovereignty, it didn't weaken it. It gave Ireland more capacity to deal with the larger neighbour. And also the EU has larger states, has states with more power, but there's no dominant state in the EU, despite the fact that some regard Germany as the hegemon, but it's not. But there are 21 small states in the EU, so it's a very comfortable place for small states in terms of treaties, law, and institutions. But it did that break, the psychological break that EU membership brought Ireland also mattered in its relations, as I said, with London. And it meant that British and Irish civil servants and British and Irish ministers were meeting in Brussels on a continuous basis. And they could have meetings at the side. It didn't have to be in the glare of publicity. It didn't have to be big summit meetings. They could have bilaterals on the edge of all of these European meetings. And that also was very important, because it allowed both the civil servants, the diplomats, but also the politicians to work with each other almost in an invisible way. It meant the newspapers didn't know about these meetings, these were informal, and it allowed for, again, much more contact. But it's also, I think, the ingredients of Ireland's success in the EU. One has to look also at the domestic. In other words, what did Ireland do at home that meant that it could succeed in this tougher environment? And I would say, if one has to think about what was the single domestic investment that the Irish made that delivered the prosperous country it is today, and that is education. From the 1960s onwards, there was free education at secondary level, and then a massive expansion of third-level education in the country. And now 52% in the country of those between 19 and 35 years of age have a university degree, whereas if you're over 65, it's less than 20%. So there was a very significant intergenerational investment in education. And I would say we were bad at roads, we were bad at lots of the hard infrastructure, but we were very good at investment in human capital. And that investment in human capital delivered, in my view, the domestic source. We also invested heavily in having a stable, very pragmatic political culture. In other words, there was no great ideological conflicts in politics. There was a determination that this small state would develop. And then I would say, if there was any habit of mind that the Irish have that helped with that domestic success or with that success, it was agility and adaptability. It's a society, because we've always had to move, we've always had a tough, historically a tough history. There's an inbuilt adaptability in the society that almost rolls with the waves of whatever happens. So it would be wrong of me to argue that it all came from outside. But, and here is the link. It could not have, the investment in education could not have delivered Irish development without, in my view, the openness to FDI. And that was a big bet that the Irish took in the early 1960s. We were still very dependent on the UK. We still had a very closed economy, high tariffs, etc., etc. And so the Irish economy was simply not technologically savvy. There was a lot of domestic production, but the quality was poor. So in the end of the 1950s, early 1960s, both at political level and at senior official level, there was a determination simply to change, to open up Ireland and to make sure that Ireland just opened to the world. And that FDI was predominantly American, but not only American. And the FDI did a number of things, apart from creating a lot of jobs. It improved the managerial competence of the society, because Irish people started to work for the multinationals, then Irish managers started to run some of these subsidiaries, but then they started to run the subsidiaries elsewhere in the world and then came back. So you gradually had a reinvestment in managerial competence and capacity through FDI. And there was not an ideological objection to FDI in the society. Ireland was seen as a capital poor society, and it needed, in order to develop, to open to the world. And then the second major development in Ireland, and this is a more recent development, the Irish historically, as the Filipinos, emigrate. And the Irish emigrated all over the world. But in this phase of Ireland's development, from the 1990s onwards, Ireland became a country of immigration and not just emigration. And today, 20% of those who live in Ireland were born elsewhere. So that's a very significant cultural and sociological shift very, very quickly. And of those, Polish citizens are the largest number, but they've gone down. The proportion of Poles, the number of Poles in Ireland have reduced over the last 8 years, and that's because the Poles came to Ireland, they made money, and they've now gone back to invest in Poland. The second largest group it comes from the United Kingdom, and despite Brexit, there is still a free labour market between Ireland and the United Kingdom. And then Indian, Romanian, and Brazilian immigrants are the last large numbers that came over the last number of years. So that again has been part of an opening of this deeply rural, conservative country is now a very different country. And the country I was born into in the 1950s no longer exists. It's a very, very different country. Now, I was going to talk about the future of Ireland in the EU, but I think what I will do is get back to the peace process. And I can talk about Ireland. So in terms of the Irish peace process and how and why that came about, what were the key dynamics? I would say the first important dynamic was a determination by the British and Irish governments together that they would have to address the ongoing conflict in the north. And without the commitment of both governments and a very small number of senior civil servants who did heroic work in building the confidence that led to the Good Friday Agreement. The second is that the Good Friday Agreement didn't suddenly appear from on high. It didn't materialize without lots and lots and lots of steps and lots of bumps and lots of difficulty. It didn't happen in a smooth process. It was hard won, hard fought, and the documents, literally there wasn't a comma in any of those in the Good Friday Agreement, but any of the previous agreements, that wasn't, in a sense, the source of a lot of discussion. The Anglo-Irish Agreement in '85, there was a declaration by Peter Brooke in 1990. He was Secretary of State for Northern Ireland, and he said that the United Kingdom no longer had any strategic or selfish interest in Northern Ireland. In other words, that the future of Northern Ireland was in the hands of the people of Northern Ireland, and that London was publicly releasing Northern Ireland from any security link to the United Kingdom. Then, under John Major, there was the Downing Street Declaration in '93, and then finally the Good Friday Agreement in '98. So that concentrated work by the British and Irish governments was an extraordinary testimony to everyone involved on both sides. And they never gave up. And there were times when I'm sure they felt like they should. Then there was a commitment among the protagonists to end the violence. And I would say that if there's one man who deserves, who in a sense created this peace process, it was John Hume. John Hume was a nationalist, but he had an extraordinary political brain. And John Hume he had a concept of what needed to happen, and he had a model in his head. You know, his view was difference is simply an accident of birth, that you must handle difference. And then in the 1980s, John Hume took an enormous risk. He started talking to Gerry Adams and the IRA. He started to talk to the gunmen. And at the time, he suffered huge opprobrium in the society. There was a very strong media campaign against him. And there was a view that he was now talking to the killers, and of course he was. But he was convinced that you can't stop violence unless you get the men of violence to stop. And so again, he was determined to to work with the IRA, and why did the IRA decide to stop? I think the biggest single explanation was a desire that you wouldn't have intergenerational transmission of the conflict, that if they didn't stop it, their children would also be in the armed struggle, and their children would be in prison, etc., etc. So there was a determination to stop at this generation, and that really mattered. And then in the early 90s, the IRA announced a ceasefire. They break that ceasefire, but they do announce it, and they only broke it once, but in a very egregious manner. So in the 90s, the circumstances had changed. I also think that we don't pay enough attention to geopolitics, because at the time, the collapse of communism, 1989, there was change in South Africa, etc. So we were living in a period of change internationally and globally, which also mattered. And then the Good Friday Agreement itself. So the other important ingredient was the role of the United States. So the US invested heavily in this. Bill Clinton, he visited Belfast in 1995, and he talked of a peace process. And he invested heavily in terms of his power and authority. And he also sent Senator George Mitchell to Belfast to chair the negotiations. And I think Mitchell, what did he bring? He brought extraordinary patience, extraordinary civility, and he just kept them at it. And then he finally said, in the lead up to the particular Good Friday, that he was going home, that either they agreed or he was going to leave. And remember, at this stage, there was years and years and years had gone into creating the conditions for this agreement. It had been very problematic to have all-party talks. They were on, off. In the background, there was a big issue about the decommissioning of weapons. So who would decommission? When would they decommission? Would the guns be put beyond use? And not just the guns, but the Semtex. So the pressure was boiling to get this agreement. And there is a wonderful play now called The Agreement, which actually looks at the last 5 days. And in the last 5 days, you had Tony Blair flying in from London, the Irish Prime Minister from Dublin, George Mitchell telling everyone, you agree by Thursday or I'm out of here, I'm leaving. And everything was still up for grabs. And the big issue was whether or not those representing the unionist parties, particularly David Trimble, the UUP, would they sign up? Because think psychologically for unionism. They had won their state and divided the island. They were insecure about their future. Demography was did not favor them. And they really David Trimble had a choice to make. Would he walk away or would he sign? And again, we should think, when we think of these negotiations, we should think of all the negotiations about the Middle East, Oslo, and et cetera, where people did walk away. And the fact that that didn't improve things, it made things worse. And so in the end, David Trimble was convinced that he could sign. He did sign. And the agreement itself, and this also matters in terms of the story, in a way, is about how you institutionalize and complicate everything. And the Good Friday Agreement has an extraordinary institutional edifice. It is institutions were created to deal with Northern Ireland, so domestic political Northern Ireland institutions based on power sharing. Then North-South institutions between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and then East-West institutions between the two islands. So you were layering complexity in the hope that by generating enough institutional density that you kept people talking and around the table. But the Good Friday Agreement was also put both to the people of Northern Ireland and the people of the Irish Republic, because in the Republic, Ireland had to change its constitution in order to take Article 2 and 3 out, which was a claim over Northern Ireland. So this institution was about really trying to lock the conflict into, to break it down and to create sufficient points of contact, east, west, north, south, within Northern Ireland, that there would be political means of addressing issues. It was overwhelmingly endorsed by the peoples of the island of Ireland, north and south, stronger in the south than in the north, because for unionism, they saw this as a major concession. And this is one of the ironies of history. Unionism won, in my view, from the Good Friday Agreement, but they thought they lost. Nationalism lost, the IRA, in my view, lost, but they thought they won. And in a way, that's the whole discourse of this agreement thereafter. Why did unionism win? It won in international law, in a solemn treaty, that the status of Northern Ireland could only be changed by the consent of the people of Northern Ireland. That there would have to be a majority of the people in Northern Ireland before the constitutional status would change. So consent was rock solid. There will never be a united Ireland unless a majority within Northern Ireland or a majority in the rest of Ireland vote for this. So consent is rock solid. So the position of unionism within the United Kingdom, in my view, is rock solid until there's a political shift, if it ever happens. The IRA had to concede that they could never achieve a united Ireland through violence. That was over. So they had to concede that their armed conflict had not delivered its purposes and outcome, but they saw themselves as being more powerful after the Good Friday Agreement because they'd got power sharing within Northern Ireland rather than just unionist domination and control. So that's the working out of the relationship between these two communities is very complex. The institutions within Northern Ireland have not worked. You could argue that the Good Friday Agreement, in terms of providing a system of politics for Northern Ireland, has not worked. We now have the institutions are not functioning as we speak because. And what happened after the Good Friday Agreement is the political extremes of both sides won. So those parties in the middle that delivered the agreement were superseded by, on the one hand, Sinn Féin on the nationalist side, and on the other, the DUP, which is more extreme, a more extreme unionist party than the UUP. But regardless of whether it's worked or not, in terms of the day-to-day politics and governing of Northern Ireland, it actually has worked in terms of non-violence, which remains an enormous prize. But then the whole relationship, both between Britain and Ireland and within Northern Ireland, was complicated by the decision of the United Kingdom in 2016 to leave the EU, because so much of this depended on joint membership of the EU. And that created a huge problem because if Britain left, as it did, then it reintroduced the problem of the border on the island of Ireland, because that's now an EU border, an external border, but it would have reintroduced, in my view, violence if you had tried to establish a border in a real sense, border posts and checks on the border on the island of Ireland. And so, in a way, the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement have now got to cope with the fact that it was designed at a time when both countries were members of the EU and no longer are. So just to sum up on the lessons, I would say that the first lesson is there's got to be a desire for peace, and there's got to be people who have a capacity to take risk for peace. Secondly, you've got to keep at it. The road bumps will be there, but you just keep at it because the prize is enormous. And thirdly, I would say that you've got to achieve an institutional framework that allows for everyone to feel that they have voice and a role in the future. And in a sense, peace processes are not about the past. The past is done. They're about creating a vision for a better future and giving people the hope that with peace comes reward. And I think that that has been the great achievement of the Good Friday Agreement. But it is not the question, the border on the island of Ireland and the relations between North and South are not a settled issue. That we don't know what the next 30 years will bring. It may bring a continuation of the status quo, or it may bring a united Ireland. And the paradox is that the best way of keeping Northern Ireland within the United Kingdom, paradoxically, was that the United Kingdom stayed in the EU. But that has destabilised. The departure of the UK from the EU has destabilised the island of Ireland in terms of the politics. So all of this is up for grabs. I don't have any future view or vision as to what will happen. But what I do know is that the Good Friday Agreement did deliver a better Ireland and a better Ireland. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor �11, for that very comprehensive, very insightful lecture. I had to give you a time limit because I wanted to entertain a couple of questions from the audience. So maybe I would like to open the floor now for questions or comments from the audience. And for those who are joining us online, you may, if we have an opportunity, you may just lodge in your questions through the chat box of the FB Live. Do we have a question? Yeah, I see a couple of hands. Yes, please. Please approach the microphone at the center of the aisle.
Good morning, Dr. Ingrid. I'm Carla from the Foreign Service Institute. I would like to ask a question regarding conflict ripeness. So we have this concept by William Sartman, which says that there is conflict ripeness when both parties are experiencing mutually harmful stalemate and both parties wanted a way out. So in the context of the Northern Ireland peace process, what was the appropriate timing for the intervention in the context of the actual and potential conflict ripeness then?
Thank you for your question. So I would say it came in the early 90s when it was clear, I think, to the British Army that they could never defeat the IRA. They could contain them, limit them, and they did. But that kind of urban insurgency is very difficult to end. And so there was no military solution for the British, but equally the IRA, there was no military victory available to them either. And in fact, violence had made things much worse for everyone. And it had, as I said, it had spread. There were bombs in urban areas in the United Kingdom. there were bombs in Dublin. So it had spread, but violence, it was no solution and could not deliver solution. And in fact, in all of these communal conflicts, violence rarely, if ever, delivers a solution, other than one side is strong enough and powerful enough to defeat the other. So I think the idea of conflict ripeness is exactly, it captures those situations where you don't have a dominant power, where the power can't win. But even if we see in Israel, Gaza today, for Israel, despite its overwhelming asymmetrical power, violence will not deliver it peace. So in a way, it's to get to a stage where people feel that there's a better prize in peace than there is in war. And one would have thought that we should have learned that in human history, but it seems it's a story and a lesson we have to keep learning.
Thank you very much, Professor. I want to entertain one more question. Yep. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I think it was a very good presentation, and I think a lot of the points from the Bangsamoro peace process also resonate, and some of the formulations are actually taken from the Northern Ireland experience as well, particularly on putting weapons beyond use. So I'm Nikki from the Norwegian Embassy, and Norway is one of those that are involved in the independent decommissioning body that oversees the DDR process down south. My question is on the governance platforms. How important is taking the weapons out of the equation? And you mentioned earlier about having sufficient points of contact. North, south, east, and west. I mean, how important are having multiple areas of engagement, discussions, and clarifications that should take place after the agreement? Obviously, the agreement isn't a period, but it continues on way after the agreement has been signed. And how important are these in the formulation now, especially after the geopolitical adjustments, EU, Brexit, and so on? Thank you.
Thank you. On decommissioning, that was a very complex process because the IRA didn't want to visibly hand in their weapons. So, in fact, both the British and Irish governments called on international experts, statesmen, military men to come and oversee this. So there was a shadow process where apparently Semtex was blown up and apparently weapon, but this was not visible in the society, but they guaranteed that it had happened. And in fact, Matti Ahtisaari, former president of Finland, was one of those involved. And again, he made an extraordinary contribution in that. So I think it's important that decommissioning has to be credible. And in order to make it credible, then it does require verification. And I think the only way to do that is internationalize it, bring people in from outside, particularly in circumstances if insurgents are unwilling to hand over to the government, which was clearly the case in Northern Ireland. I think it took too long. I think the IRA should have been much more prepared. But there was also a dynamic within republicanism, and there were what are referred to as the hard men. And the hard men didn't want to cease violence at all. So again, inevitably in insurgent movements, you have people who move to the peace end of the spectrum, but you will always have that group that are at the other end. In terms of the opportunities for I think it is one of the unfortunate side effects of Brexit, and a real tragedy, in my view, that British-Irish relations that had been completely normalised with the visit of the late Queen in September 11, that had normalised, it was the first time a British monarch had visited the Irish state since its foundation, even though we're neighbours. And it had completely normalised relations between the two countries. It was very symbolic and very powerful and really mattered at a societal level. It wasn't a government, it was clearly governmental, but it was societal. And I think Brexit has really torn a hole in that relationship. I remain to be convinced that the government in London is particularly interested in Northern Ireland at the moment. It has other problems. And so I think that original investment from the two governments that was so important is less, the investment is weaker now. And I think that's a pity. And it's really important because peace is something that's constructed and never finished. So you need to continue to pay attention. And it's not good for Northern Ireland that it doesn't have a government. It's not good that its local politicians are not running it. It's now being run by the Secretary of State for Northern Ireland from London. And the other thing that appears to have happened is during the intense period of the peace process, you had a lot of very senior British civil servants in and out of Belfast all the time. It's no longer the case. So I think that Northern Ireland, so there is also an experiment, an economic experiment at the moment. Because of the way in which Brexit has happened, Northern Ireland remains part of the UK internal market, but it also has access for manufactured goods to the EU market. And so the question is, will you see also a change in the economic complexion of Northern Ireland, where you strengthen the North-South economy, and that Northern Ireland actually has higher growth than the rest of the UK at the moment. So again, there's a dynamism there, but it's very difficult to read where it goes.
Thank you very much, Professor. In the interest of time, I will have to end the open forum session now because we still have a closing to formally thank you for coming to the Philippines. We encourage everyone who have questions and comments to please email to the Foreign Service Institute or comments, and we'll be sure to forward this to Professor Llafan. At this point, I would like to call on Assistant Secretary Noel Fernandez to award the Certificate of Appreciation. May I read the citation? The Foreign Service Institute awards this Certificate of Appreciation to Professor Bridget Llafan for her invaluable service as speaker at the Mabini Dialogue Series, the Northern Ireland Peace Process, Lessons for the Philippines, given the 16th day of November 2023 at the Foreign Service Institute. Thank you very much, everyone, for joining us today. We'll see you again in future Mabini Dialogues, and we invite you for some refreshments at the back, outside the library, rather. Thank you.